Hi, everybody. I'm Liz, and I'm an alcoholic, as will be evidenced in the next 40 minutes. I have a sponsor. My sponsor has a sponsor. My sponsor's here tonight. I sponsor some ladies who are here tonight. My sobriety date is November 24th, 2013, and I picked up my first and only white chip at that time, and I was 59 years old. So I'll be 71 this coming fall, and I'll have 12 years of sobriety this November. Now, I say that because I was doing a little math the last time I told my story, and kind of a sad fact is that my mother died of this disease at 73. So, when I think back about when I came into these rooms at 59, had I not come into these rooms, I was on that downward spiral trajectory and maybe would have 1 or 2 years left to live if I had stayed on that path. And that's a sobering thought, no pun intended. Anyhow, so, I appreciate Tim asking me to do this tonight. I did this after I was 3 years sober for the first time, and it's just amazing to me how so much is the same, but so much is different. So I think the story will be a little bit different than it was the first time I told it. Hopefully there'll be more minutes in the solution than what it used to be like. But we'll just see, where God takes me with this. Anyhow, so I grew up in a big family. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. I was the second born of 6 children. My father we grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. My father was a up-and-coming trauma surgeon, and my mother had been a pediatric nurse before she had 6 children in 8 years. And this was, in the mid to late 50s, so people had big families back then, and we lived in a neighborhood, and, my parents really were both alcoholics, and I like to say they were country club alcoholics, because, there really wasn't a lot of chaos, except for the fact there was a lot of kids, but, we were well behaved, my parents were well respected in the community, but they drank, and they drank pretty heavily every single night, and I thought that was just the normal way to be, so I grew up with, daily drinking as my role model, and I always thought that was what made you a grown-up, and that's the first thing that I wanted from alcohol, was to be a grown-up, because I watched my parents drink, I watched them get dressed up to go out to dinner at the country club. I wanted that. My father was a very interesting person, and I have to mention it because it really did have such a big impact on my life. Being a trauma surgeon, that in itself, probably describes a lot to people who know about that kind of ego. But he was a fascinating person. He really expected a lot of his kids. I used to like to say that we were sort of like the Von Trapp family from The Sound of Music. There was all these kids, and we wanted to please our dad. And when I got into high school, we really butted heads. My older sister, who was 15 months older than I am, was a Fulbright scholar and valedictorian of the class. It was very hard to compete with her. And so I kind of took a different tack. I was going to be the rebel and a little bit of a maverick. And so we butted heads. He always thought that my boyfriends were too old and my skirts were too short. My mother used to say that we didn't get along because we were too much alike. And I said, oh, well, that's great. That means I'm a narcissistic, elitist, egomaniac. and that was a lot for me to unpack in my 35th step. But anyhow, the drinking, I remember my first drink, I was probably 13 or 14, at an airport bar in Memphis. I had a fake ID. I looked older than I was. And like I said, that's what I wanted from alcohol, was to be a grown-up. I wasn't one of these people that really took off with alcohol. I didn't really like the taste of it. I didn't even really like the way it made me feel. I just liked the way it made me look. The drink with the umbrella and it was vodka Collins and, back in the day of cocktails and, it was a sophisticated thing. So, I do remember that. And, in elementary school and in high school, we drank, and I was, like I said, I looked the oldest and I had a fake ID, and so I would be the one that would go and get the 3-2 beer in Mississippi and all of that. But I didn't really enjoy drinking it that much. In fact, I was the kind of girl that would pour the drink in the potted plant and make it look like I was drinking because it was a way of belonging. And that was the other thing that I really wanted from alcohol, was to belong in the group because, like so many of us say, I didn't really feel all that comfortable in my own skin. and the alcohol made me feel like I was part of the group. Not the effect of the alcohol, because I still really wasn't all that interested in it. I would pretend to drink. Fake it till you make it. I made it. Anyhow, so that was fairly uneventful. I was popular in high school. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. I was a cheerleader. But, I really kind of secretly wanted to be a bad girl. So I pretended to be, and it's just funny when I think back of it now. I went away to college. I went to Dallas, Texas from Memphis because I wanted to get far away from my dad so that he couldn't control my life anymore. Or at least I thought that would help. So I went to school in Dallas, and I immediately fell into a group of friends that were hippies. This was in the early 70s, 1972. Again, I still wasn't heavily drinking. We drank a little bit, but what we really did was we experimented with drugs. And this was the era of, make love, not war. If it feels good, do it. Tune out, turn on. The kind of drugs we did were the Timothy Leary variety mostly. We were trying to change our consciousness. And this group of friends that we weren't sororities or fraternities. We were really into studying auras and trying to get in touch with, to get closer to God. We used peyote and acid and mushrooms and all of that. And it was for a spiritual experience. Until I discovered one day that I was just trying to tie my shoes. And then I was like, well, maybe it's not all it's cut out to be. But that's what we were looking for. We practiced a lot of yoga, spent a lot of time in ashrams. I was a spiritual seeker. In fact, I can remember being in the 4th grade, or maybe even before that, and just having a real strong spiritual experience, like knowing that there was a power greater than me, knowing with a capital K. So I've always had a real strong sense of, something there, and looked for it all my life. So one of the things I was looking for in drugs and alcohol at this point was a spiritual connection, a cosmic consciousness. We read Ram Dass, Be Here Now. Carlos Castaneda, Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. So I know that that's probably dated for a lot of you here, but that was what we did. We were looking to be close to God. We were, this new free women's lib, sit in circles, encounter groups. It was a very exciting time to be a drug addict. And we had a lot of fun. We really did. And that's where I met my future ex-husband. And he was wonderful. He was so much fun. He was probably the most fun person I've ever known, and super smart. And if you wanted to go where the fun was, you followed him. And we just had a great time. And he was a pretty big drinker then. He didn't drink alcoholically, but in college, when people do drink, he was always the life of the party. Eventually we got married. I was thinking, we moved to East Texas, and we both worked in a therapeutic camping program for adjudicated juvenile delinquents. These were boys who were 13 to 17 years old, serious offenders, and they lived in an experimental camping program in the piney woods of East Texas. And we moved to Nacogdoches from Dallas, and he was a caseworker and I was a teacher. It was a really high burnout job because there was so much recidivism, but it was really interesting. And one of the things that the boys had to build their own structures and cook their own food, and they didn't have any entertainment, no phones, of course there wasn't cell phones back then, and no music. And I remember I played acoustic guitar, and I had an old beat-up guitar. The bass string buzzed, and the boys gave me a cigarette butt to put in the fret so that the bass string wouldn't buzz. And I would play and sing. I taught art and music, and again, it was a really fun time. And that's when I first started drinking as a solution, because that job was so stressful, and we had to drive 2 hours to get out into the woods every day. And the other 2 teachers that I worked with, on the way home, we would drink beer, and we could drink 6 beers in 2 hours in hot, piney woods. And I remember just how that was such a relief. And, I was probably in my early 20s about that time. Early to mid-20s. Anyhow, I can remember that my wedding week was when I really learned that alcohol could be my solution. Because I got married in Tampa, where the rest of my family was living at the time. My husband and I had lived together for 5 years before we got married, but the wedding week was a big deal because, my parents wanted to have a social occasion, and my husband's parents wanted to have a social occasion, so they were trying to outdo themselves for who could have the best party. It was a whole week long. So there was a lot of social pressure, and I remember that's when I really discovered that drinking enough white wine could make me not care about what was going on around me and not worry so much about whether I was being okay. And that's when it really clicked to me. They say that long before we realize it, alcohol is more than just a mere habit. And when I think back to those years, I was probably 24. It was the beginning of a fatal progression at that point. Still wasn't too terribly bad, and we quit doing all the hard drugs, or most of the time the hard drugs, maybe on special occasions. But and I'm trying to think what happened next. Okay, so I drank for 35 years, so that's a long story. That's a lot to tell before you get to the sober part, so I'm trying to kind of skip through it a little bit because that's a lot of years. My husband decided to go to work on his PhD in clinical psychology, and we moved to Lawrence, Kansas, which is where he was going to school. I got pregnant and had my daughter in Lawrence. That was in 1980, so some years had passed, and this was the time of my life where it was fun. We had fun. We were kind of an up and coming couple. My drinking was starting to tick up, but it still wasn't really causing any big problems too much. When we got to Lawrence, my husband got real serious about school. And this was back in the days when you had to go to the computer lab to work on the computer. You didn't have it on your phone, and you actually had to go somewhere. Here I was with a newborn baby, and I was used to having a lot of attention. When we lived in East Texas, I played a lot of benefit concerts, with the guitar and the singing and the friends, and I had a lot of attention there. We moved to Lawrence. I didn't know anybody. I had this new baby. My husband was never home. He wasn't any fun anymore. And he got real serious about his school and about being a father, and it was like he changed. And I was sort of the quintessential frustrated party girl. It was like, where's my fun? And so I started playing some open mic nights in Lawrence to get to know some people. And that was the other thing too. I had to go back to work, and my in-laws, my parents, everybody wanted me to teach because I had this teaching certification. But I thought, no, I've got this baby, and I just want to minimize hours and maximize dollars. So of course I got a job in a bar. The rationalization of it was, so I could minimize hours and maximize dollars, but, it was really so I could be around the alcohol. At the time, I would never in a million years have admitted that. Looking back on it, it's so clear to me now. It's crazy. So I started getting a little bit of notoriety in Lawrence. People started to recognize me and notice me, and I started playing in a duo and a trio, and I loved being married. I think I was a pretty good wife. I liked to entertain. I think I was a really good mother. I was devoted. But I wasn't really very good at being married, if you know what I mean. Like I said, I was kind of just sort of a minor celebrity in a small town, and so I was getting a lot of attention. Just decided that the grass would be greener on the other side of the street. And decided to leave my husband, and that because he was no fun anymore, and I was getting a lot of attention from a lot of other places. That was really the beginning of a real bad time for me. I was a mother for a week and then off for a week, shared custody, 1 week on, 1 week off. I was in my late 20s, like I said, sort of a local celebrity, a little more grandiose in my mind than it really was. But I was managing a jazz club there where there were a lot of famous musicians came in and out. So, I really thought I had arrived. And because of my sort of popularity, other what we like to call outside issues, the powdered form of alcohol started coming into play. And people would give it to me because, I was the manager of this jazz club, and they thought that would, give them perks if they sucked up to me. So before you knew it, I was really out of control. I was up all night, it was a grungy time. Y'all can remember, some of y'all I'm sure can remember, those mornings where you haven't been to bed and you're gritting your teeth and you just feel like, ugh. And those were the weeks that I didn't have my daughter, and the weeks that I did have my daughter, I had to, straighten up and be a normal person. And this was when it just got so bad because my drinking self didn't align with my real self, and that created so much conflict that I was so ashamed that all I could do was drink more, and it really, really got to be a downward spiral. I don't know if any of y'all ever saw the movie Forrest Gump. Remember Jenny, the girl? This year's remind me of that because when I got towards my bottom in Lawrence, I was in my late 20s, and I felt that feeling, that scene where she's standing on the ledge in the big platform shoes and she's thinking about jumping, and that's the way I felt one morning. I remember trying to sleep, and I really just literally felt my life was going down the drain. It was really pretty pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization. But that wasn't my bottom with alcohol. That's when I decided that I was not going to be a drug-addicted mother. And I was going to move to Atlanta, which is where my parents were at the time. My dad at this point was chief surgeon at Grady Hospital. I called out to them, and that's the other thing I wanted to mention. People talk about their families, and my family didn't make me an alcoholic. They were alcoholics, but they loved me dearly, and they would do anything for me. And, my mother flew out to Lawrence, and we drove my old bombed-up Chevrolet all the way from Lawrence to Atlanta, with the baby in the back and the guitar. And it was like, I just cried out for help. I said, I've got to move home. I came home divorced with a 5-year-old, no money, just, my scorecard read 0, pretty much, is like it says in the book. But I moved in with my parents. I got a job as a recruiter, which was very difficult, but I knew that I had to do something. I quit the cocaine, which is amazing. The geographical cure allowed me to get away from that, but I didn't quit drinking, because drinking was normal. That was, I was living with my family for a year, and I was 31 years old, so I drank for another 29 years before I came into these rooms. And so, that's kind of what I call the years in Lawrence, I call those the self-seeking years. I was looking for fun. I didn't want the party to be over. And when I got to Atlanta, and I thought, pull myself up from my bootstraps, and this was the self-will run riot years. Because I already knew at this point that I was powerless over alcohol, because I had tried to stop, and I couldn't. But I damn sure wouldn't admit that my life was unmanageable. No. Give me guts, I'll put them in a row. I was determined. And so I just lived with my parents for a year. I got some success in the recruiting business, but I was drinking every single day. I can remember going to pick up my daughter from after-school daycare. I worked at Colony Square for 13 years, was one of the offices that I had. I would go downstairs to the food court, and get 2 beers to go from Midtown to Buckhead to pick up my daughter at daycare. 2 beers in the car. And then I would go home, and I would just have 1 drink. Rationalization, justification, so I would do anything to deny the fact that I was an alcoholic, or maybe I knew that I was powerless over alcohol, that I had to drink every day, but like I said, I would damn sure not admit that my life was unmanageable. And most of my drinking I did, later in the evening. I never was a day drinker, and it didn't interfere too much with my life, except for when it did. And that was those nights that you just, daughter would be in Washington, D.C. with her dad. He had moved there to finish his Ph.D., or she'd be spending the night with a neighbor, and, we'd go out in Buckhead, and just the things that would happen, I don't really have to go into detail. You all know all those stories. And it was not a good way to live. And like I said, that this dichotomy between my drinking self and my real self and my spiritual self were getting so far apart that it caused a lot of conflict, and it just caused me to drink more and more and more and more. I like I said, was a devoted mother, and I would do anything for my daughter. but I could not stop drinking for her. I remember one time she said, Mom, and, I'd like to say that I shielded her a lot from my drinking, but, the thing about the drinking, even if you're not abusive or chaotic, you're just not present, when you're drinking. And I really regret that. We have a very, very close relationship today, but once she got in high school, it was harder for me to hide my drinking, and she saw that I got pretty drunk every night. And one time, she was later in high school, she said, Mom, I think it'd be a good idea if you tried to quit drinking for 30 days. She'd watch some TV show or something. I said, you're right. I'm drinking too much, and you're right, and I'll do it. Well, I made it 2 weeks, and one night we were going out to dinner. I was upstairs in my bathroom getting ready to go out to dinner, and she was in her bedroom, and all the vodka in the house was gone. That was my drink of choice. But there was some bourbon in there, and I'd been sober for 2 weeks, and we were getting ready to go out to dinner, and I thought, what would it hurt if I just had a little bourbon? I poured it in a glass and took it upstairs. Sure enough, she comes upstairs, and I saw her in the mirror, and she saw the drink in the table beside me, and her face, the way her face fell, it was just, I'll never forget it. She didn't say anything. She just turned around and walked out of the room. We never discussed it. And like I said, I would do anything for my daughter, anything, but I could not stop drinking for her. I couldn't stop drinking for anybody, and it was, when she went off to college, and then it got really bad, the group of recruiters I worked with, we reorganized under independent company names, so now I had my own business and was working primarily from home, and my daughter was away at college, and my life just got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. I couldn't really go out and drink socially anymore because I couldn't drink the way I wanted to drink. All those years, all those 29 years, I couldn't really seriously even date anyone because unless they were just a drinking buddy, they would find out how much I drank, and that's just not normal. And that doesn't bode well for healthy relationships. I used to like to say it was because it wouldn't be good for my daughter for me to have a string of relationships. Again, another way to rationalize, justify my own behavior. So anyhow, it just got smaller and smaller and smaller. And I started getting hurt. I started getting bruises. I remember I cracked a rib. I was a falling down drunk in my own house every night. And, it just got worse and worse and worse. I had bruises all over my arms, and, I could always say, oh, this happened, the horse pushed me, or this happened, or whatever, I could have an excuse. But one night, I was particularly drunk, and fell in my living room somewhere. I'm not even sure where. But I got up and looked in the mirror, and I had this huge gash in my eye. Huge gash in my eye. An inch higher, and it probably would have killed me. An inch lower, it would have blinded me, whatever I fell on. But I realized that I wasn't going to be able to hide this. This was my face. So, and I couldn't drive myself to the emergency room. I clearly needed stitches. So I called my sister, who's also in the program. Many of you know her. She's here tonight. And it was about 9 o'clock at night, and the miracle was that she answered the phone. Because usually when I would call her at 9 o'clock at night, she wouldn't answer the phone. By this point, she had been in this program for 20 years. And we were really close, but we just didn't talk at night because she knew that that's probably not a great time to talk to me. Anyhow, thank God she picked up the phone, and she was probably over here at Nava, or somewhere. Anyhow, I said, I need your help. And I said, I've fallen, and I need to go to the emergency room. And she came and picked me up, and that was my pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization because I couldn't hide it anymore. The gig was up. I was a falling down drunk, and there was no way that I could pretend that it was anything other than what it was. My life had gotten so tiny small. I had very few social relationships. I drank at home alone every single night. We're sitting in the emergency room. It was just awful. In fact, I remember saying, you should just take me to rehab. And she said, well, why don't you sleep on it? We'll talk about it in the morning. Got home. All right, so it's 3 o'clock in the morning. I get home from the emergency room. What do you think the first thing I did? Poured a drink. That was the last drink I ever had. And it was on or about November 24th, 2013. The next morning, I did not go to my first meeting. In fact, I don't think I got out of bed that whole entire day. I had 16 stitches in my eyelid. The following day, I came to my first meeting. And it was right here in this room. It was the Bridge Builders. Julie took me. I remember not much about the meeting at all, but I do remember this big flood of relief that I had because, by the end of my drinking, really what I wanted, I was such a power driver. I had to do this big commission job, and I had to be successful, and I had to push, and I drank for oblivion, that total peace. Obviously, the alcohol quit working, the gig was up, I walked into this meeting, and I remember feeling such a sense of relief. It's like, I don't have to do this anymore. I finally had reached step one. I realized that my life had become unmanageable. When you have to fill yourself up off the floor, you can't take yourself to the emergency room, and you're on your face. You can't hold it anymore. That's what began this journey for me, and it took a long time. My sponsor, the first time I ever heard this phrase was that, I was kind of looking for a microwave solution to a crock pot problem. And as much as I was ready for this program, and I would do anything, I would have crawled across cut glass to get sober and to get rid of this way of living that was just not working. That awful feeling where you imagine your life without alcohol, but you can't imagine it going on to the bitter end either. So I would have done anything. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Well, I thoroughly followed the path. I walked in these doors, and I've always been sort of an all or nothing person, and I was all in from day one. Like I said, I would have done anything. But it still took some time. I wanted to be that woman that was going to be well by Thursday, but it didn't work out that way because, time takes time. This I must earn, and there was so much I had to unlearn about myself. And still unlearning, and now learning, how to live it a much better way. I remember being so nervous. I would come to meetings late. I would sit in my car until it was right time for the meeting to start, and then I would run in my car as soon as the meeting was over. And, so all of this took time. Those of you that know me think that I'm, well connected here and that I just, get along and everybody's my friend. I had to develop those relationships by putting the time in. I started service work really, really early, worked down in the kitchen, still work down in the kitchen. And then the biggest thing was trying to learn how to live life without anesthesia. That was the big thing. This idea of 24-hour segments was brilliant because anything more than that would have blown my mind. But I knew that I could get through the day, come to a meeting, I'd make a big X on my calendar. I had a wall calendar, and I would put an X. Sometimes I'd go to bed at 6 o'clock at night just so I could put the X on the calendar and get into bed and pull the covers up. So it's not easy to get sober. It's not easy. And I had to put down the drink, and I had to ask for help. But you guys are the ones that helped me. And, they talk about how alcohol blocks the sunlight of the spirit. And I always knew that there was that power greater than myself. But the alcohol and the drugs clamped the water hose and the flow couldn't come. And so it wasn't until I quit drinking that was able to come back to me. And when I realized that was the key to getting sober, that I had to ask a power greater than myself to help me, what a game changer. What a game changer. Because I didn't have a problem with that, especially once the channel was cleared. Dear God, please keep me sober today. And I still say that every day. And then I came to believe that God could take away the compulsion to drink alcohol every single day. He could do anything. He could take away all these other things that were making me so unhappy. The self-seeking, the selfishness, the sense of entitlement, the blame, the hurt, all of those things. For so many years, I just blamed, ignored, buried, justified, rationalized. And it wasn't until I learned in here how to self-examine, how to look, how to admit, and how to accept that I started to get this freedom that was just amazing. And like I said, it didn't happen overnight, and it's still happening. I remember being 3 years sober and realizing that I was afraid of some things. I never thought I was afraid of anything. I was this type A, self-willed person. You take away the self-medication, you take away the anesthesia, and then all the fears and the anxieties that I had to learn to live with and to get rid of, and the same power that kept me sober one day at a time has been able to chip away at these other things that make me so unhappy. So I'm able to live in my own skin as if I were under the influence. But I'm not under the influence of drugs and alcohol. This program has given me everything that I wanted from alcohol. I wanted to be a grown-up. And I finally feel like, I can squarely meet my obligations now. I show up when I say I'm going to show up, except for when I had COVID back in January. I was supposed to tell my story all back, but I was sick. So now I feel like I finally have started to grow up. I still have a long way to go, but I'm growing up at 71. And certainly I feel like I belong. I belong in these rooms. I belong with you people. I have friends outside of the rooms. I have other volunteer jobs I do besides NABA. I have a big, full life. And I finally belong. I'm not a square peg in a round hole. And we have a lot of fun, which was one of the other things that I looked for years in alcohol and drugs. And, obviously the closer to God, I've certainly gotten that too. And, very often a real feeling of peace. Not every day, not all the time, but more and more and more. The more I learn to discard the stuff that doesn't work, that doesn't serve me, and the more I hang on to the stuff that is the good stuff. And, I believe it's all about connection. Connection with people and connection with the higher power. I always say that connection treats addiction. Because, alcohol, wants to get me alone and kill me, and it damn near did. And it wasn't until I was able to really ask for you to come in, and all of you, God with skin, and the higher power, my higher power itself. It says this in the book, and I never thought that I would get there, but I am getting there. I'm finding today that the best source of emotional stability for me is not other people. It's my higher power himself. I used to get so lonely. And now sometimes just being alone with my higher power and my dog is the most peaceful place for me to be. And I just never ever thought that I could be that way. I always needed affirmation. I always needed you to tell me I was smart and pretty and fun. And, now there's this, it's filling up that God-sized hole with real, authentic self and God's self and God's consciousness and real relationships. And, no amount of pomp and circumstance can take the place of that. I'm going to wrap it up because I'd like for us to have a little time for fellowship, but I don't want to forget anything that I had on my notes here. No, really, I think that, the sense of relief that I have, living the life that I have today is indescribable. And there's a quote in step 12 that I think I'll use to close with, and I just love it. It really speaks to me, and I hope it'll speak to you too. This is out of step 12. It's towards the very end. It says, "True ambition is not what I thought it was. True ambition is the deep desire to live usefully and walk humbly under the grace of God." And I do that with just a little progress at a time. Thank you for your time tonight. What a great story. Thank you so much.
First I slept and then I crept to a hope-filled dream. You rescued me and finally waking there I see. I look into love's window for a soul that's meant for me. Takes me where the promises all sometimes quickly, sometimes slow. We get just what we need on a broad highway. Drive for stride, we walk eternally.